Welcome to the Talkback for Ethan Hawke's fascinating and unique film about Flannery O'Connor, Wildcat. I'm Judy Distler, co-founder of the Teaneck International Film Festival, and I'm joined today by Robin Brancato, former Teaneck teacher, and who's currently teaching at the Learning Collaborative in Rockland County. She has written 8 books. I'm so glad I thought of her as somebody whom I knew would know about Flannery O'Connor. I was an English major, but I can't remember having read her. And I think Robin will have all the answers you need, everything you want to know about this incredible author. I want to thank her, and I want to thank the sponsor of this film, Wendy DeSanti of Wildcat Realty, and we'll begin. Robin, how did you first meet Flannery O'Connor and become acquainted with the work?
Of course, I wish I had met her in person. I never did. And I'm going to start right off saying I'm not going to know everything at all about Flannery O'Connor. In fact, I don't consider myself an expert, but I do consider myself somebody who watched this film very carefully and who is used to talking about films. So let's, in addition to talking about her and her life, let's talk about what is in this film. But in terms of my first introduction, I guess back in college, I read some Flannery O'Connor, and of course, some things stick with you about the oddness and the peculiarity and the originality of her stories. But I needed to reread stories once I knew I was approaching the subject today. I really needed to reread several ones, especially ones that are reflected in the film itself. First of all, I had the enjoyment of once visiting Flannery O'Connor's house, which has been preserved in Savannah. She was born there, and the film, I think, makes it clear that she lived mostly in Milledgeville, Georgia. But when I was looking for pictures that I had taken when I went to her house, and the only one I found was this, which is, a hand puppet of Flannery O'Connor. Wow. And I'm standing there. This is about 10 or 15 years ago. So that's my main personal connection with Flannery, aside from having enjoyed and marveled over and been very mystified by a lot of her stories.
And in watching this film, do you think it matters if you've been familiar with her and have read her stories before or haven't? Does it make a difference?
I think, first of all, I think Ethan Hawke would say, in fact, he did say, because I read some interviews with him, that he wanted it to stand alone, of course. And I'm thinking that he's hoping that people will become engaged in Flannery enough to be wanting to read stories or reread them. On the other hand, I have to say that once I had reread some of the stories that are referenced in the film, it did make me enjoy details of the film more. So you can have it both ways there. And there are 5 stories that are woven into the biographical information, and along the way we'll probably talk a little bit about who the characters are, what those stories are, and how they reflect things about her personal life.
What do they tell you about who she was as you watch this on the film? And do you think it's an accurate depiction of who she was?
Yeah. First of all, I believe that Ethan Hawke and the other co-writer, Shelby Gaines, have worked very hard to reference documents. I don't think that there's very much that's been made up in the film, and obviously they had to invent some dialogue in certain cases. But so that I think that we get a pretty accurate picture of what I imagine she was like, and a person who was always at odds with her environment. You can see that a lot in the movie, and people can probably now think about scenes where, from the very beginning, that show that she's not satisfied with herself or with many other people. In fact, I think that there's a line somewhere about her being either the way she feels about people is she can either sort of slightly tolerate them or not tolerate them or something like that. So we get a picture of her as someone whose relationship with her background and family was always in conflict. We'll talk later, I'm sure, about her and her mother. We could even talk about
Yeah.
that right now. But there are many scenes in the film that show her being impatient, angry at herself, and right from the start, it's got to be said that her religious feelings and beliefs and searching is major to her life and her stories. And even though that is not well, in fact, I would say that the scene in the film that was most moving to me is the one with the priest. Now, maybe we'll come back to that later. But anyway, yeah, I think it's accurate and it's pretty full, and it shows her vulnerabilities and her. We'll talk more about what her ideas and interests are.
Do you know, or did you come across anything while you were doing research on it? Why did Ethan Hawke make this film? Why did he want to write about her?
Okay, well, I read originally that as a young person, he lived with his mother in Atlanta for a time, and that his mother had on her shelf a lot of books by Flannery O'Connor that he started to read, sort of precociously reading them before he was really ready for them, but that he always had this fascination and thought that everybody knew Flannery O'Connor, that she was sort of like a Shakespeare because of his orientation. However, I now have read more information, including some interviews with him. And it turns out that the idea for the film was his daughter's idea. Okay. His daughter, Maya Hawke, who plays, of course, not only Flannery, but all of those subsidiary roles of characters in her stories. And that it was actually Maya who begged him to do this. I might even have a line to quote here. I'd have to grope for it to get it actually right. But she then asked him to be the director. He said it's the first time anybody, I mean, he has directed other films, but this was like the first time somebody came to him and asked him to be a director. And it turned out to be very much a family affair because his wife was also involved in some aspects of it. And it turns out that Maya, I mean, if I'm talking about how Ethan was obsessed with Flannery O'Connor, sounds as if Maya was even more so, and actually wrote, I think, a thesis for college about the prayer journal of Flannery O'Connor, which I'm sure was accessed a lot in the writing of the script here, because I think a lot of the lines are right out of Flannery's mouth.
I had asked you, I think, about the name Wildcat. I found something online, I don't know if it's true, that it reflects her refusal to be tamed. She had said, I don't want to do pretty. But it's also the title of one of her stories.
Yes, it is. And I think that's about as much of an answer as we're going to find. I wondered for a long time. And then I realized one of her very early stories is called Wildcat. I read that thinking maybe that was going to give me a clue, but it didn't. It's not one of the ones that's referred to in the movie. Anyway, but yes, she was a scrapper and a wildcat in terms of her, as we see in the film, her not wanting to take the dictates of the publisher Reinhardt. It's got to be, does she have to write an outline? No, that's not her writing. And throughout, we see her defending her positions and being a real scrapper.
Yeah. And I hadn't remembered reading her. I don't know that I did. I now have this, which everyone who watches the film might want to get. This is thanks to Jeremy Lentz, who gave it to me.
Okay, I have one too. I have one too.
But the critics, I found the film fascinating. I watched it twice, got more out of it the second time. The critics weren't very kind. And I thought the integration of the stories with real life was fabulous. And the way the stories were brought to life was wonderful. How did you feel about that?
Well, I think that I certainly understand why that decision was made. In fact, there were a whole lot of quotes from Ethan about, he wanted to make a point that somebody's mind and imagination and reality is all confused and mixed. so that the film has a little bit of confusion because of that. And each one of the stories is supposed to sort of be juxtaposed with something that's happening in her real life. And but unless you know the stories, then that doesn't matter so much. And in any case, the stories make you, I think, want to read them, or at least the references in the stories make you want to see what the whole thing is, because these are the versions that we see in the film have been very truncated, very abbreviated, but a lot of the lines are the same, and the characters, I think, are very well cast, very well drawn. And as I said, there are 5 specific stories that are used. The collection that we just showed you a vision of has 31 stories, which I think is probably about as many as she wrote. Now, during the film, there are references to her wanting to write a novel. She's not even talking so much about stories. That novel turned out to be Wise Blood, which was an amalgam of a bunch of her stories. So, and I have to say that I don't remember if I ever read it. I see now not only that there is a movie version of it, but that I saved it on my TV. So maybe tonight I'm going to watch Wise Blood.
Wise Blood?
Yes, that's the novel she was.
Was that her only novel, or was there a second novel?
There were stories were published with titles, and maybe one of the titles being the cover title, and with collection. As far as I know, everything else is stories.
When she was reworking that first novel, she had said something in the film about she didn't want to do it. She couldn't stand doing it anymore, and that's why she was writing so many stories.
Yes, I'm glad you remember that line, because yes, and it turned out that that was the way to go, as she then once her diagnosis of lupus was occurred, and she was basically trapped in the home of her mother in Milledgeville, Georgia. She went on to live 14 years, and that scene that I referred to about her having a conversation with the priest, I think, is very illuminating. And I don't know how much of that was invented, because I don't know whether there would be a record of the priest giving her this advice. So maybe that
unless she wrote about it. I wrote down one thing that he had said that struck me when he was talking to her: joy is sorrow overcome.
Yes, and that was one of his final words there. And she's asking him, first of all, if we're going to feel sympathy for Flannery, it's about how desperate she is to want to find grace. Okay. And we can argue about what grace is, and even the priest isn't, I think, absolutely sure what grace is.
What is finding grace?
Well, we have to imagine what she meant by it. And it was some sort, first of all, for her, a very, as understanding of, or connection with God, that was going to, I guess she felt, free her or something like that. That what the priest says is that all she can do is her little bit, and she says, all I can do is write. And he said, well, then do it right. And if your writing is honest, then he's kind of saying, then maybe you'll find grace. And maybe she did. We don't know for sure.
Yeah. There was something else I was looking for, but I don't remember. What do you think her takes were on what she was writing about? She's been accused by some of having been racist. She's been accused others have said she's just reflecting the time in which she was living. There was a scene at the party for Cal, who's Robert Lowell, where she defends how she's writing about Black people, and she doesn't want to change reality, right?
Yes. First of all, the times she was born in 1925. So, and events of the film begin, I believe, in 1950. By the way, the film is not chronological because remember we have a break where it says
Goes
2 years
and forth.
earlier when she's at Iowa. So
Yeah.
all of these portions of her life, I think, are very that contribute to the total of her. But she's kind of a solid figure throughout, or a figure throughout. In any case, she grew up in an area mostly rural, but at one point, I think in the film, it mentions, and it may be her mother, wait, I forget which character it is, mentioning the 4 types of people, and I'm not going to be able to recite all 4, but the people who were once in power and have lost it, like like her actual mother, and then white trash, and then black people. And I'm
Black
not
people who had property or something.
Yes, okay,
Yeah.
because yes, property, major thing, and reputation and what people thought of you, think of you is obviously foremost in the mind of her mother, and it's something that disturbed her all along. And so that when we meet Flannery in the movie, she's the story she's creating are an attempt, I think, to cover all these 4 different types. And she's particularly drawn to people who have lost something or seeking something, and often they have lost something physically, like they have lost a limb. And the fact that she is diagnosed with a serious illness, I think, may be connected. Although we don't want to make too much of her biography being the reason for her fiction. But in terms of her feelings about her relationship with Black people, it is complicated. She is, as you said, at the party, when someone says you'd be better off using the word Negro instead, she insists on not being told what to do. This is the reality. And of course, it was the reality then.
Right.
Most critics who have approved of her are attributing it to her sense of reality and the way that the times were. I think we can even find some incidents of her statements that may seem negative about Black people, but I think the characters that she creates will say it better than whatever we find about her biography. In other words, the characters that she creates who are Black, it seems to me, the ones that I have met in my rereading, do not do any injustice to the race. So
yeah. At one point, her mother says to her, "I don't understand why you don't want to write something that people might like to read." Do we know more about? I mean, we certainly see it in the film, but do we know more about her family background? Her father also had lupus. Do we know more about her relationship?
Well, I think that her mother's saying that, and her mother saying, can't you just smile a little and so forth, it was a huge irritant to her, but she, of course, uses it in her stories. And I think I read in one of the reviews or something that the mother appears as in her stories. Her mother keeps reappearing, not just as a mother, but sometimes as another character who is this, often irritant, and often, begging for a return to the fame or whatever that her family once had, and so forth. And so this irritant was something that worked I think, toward helping Flannery to have a subject, to have a topic. Okay. By the way, we haven't said too much yet about the fact that the characters are often, even if they're not physically or mentally disabled, they have something else extraordinarily, perhaps grotesque about them. And some people have said that, have maybe criticized Flannery that she exaggerated so much, but the poet Elizabeth Bishop, who was shown in the film in a little scene at that party, in real life said, I went to Milledgeville and visited, and she wasn't exaggerating. That's how
it was just like that, right? It was like that. Yeah. What
And
did the critics think of her at the time? I mean, she was published, right? Her stories were published, maybe
but
not in
yes,
the magazines her mother read, but
right, and not, certainly not commercially successful, and not even critically successful at first. And I'm not really an expert on that. I'm not going to get into what the critics said then. She has gradually been prized enough so that this particular collection that you held up won the National Book Award. So in any case, one thing, even though this is not answer to the question, when we're talking about Elizabeth Bishop, we had also already mentioned Robert Lowell, who was her mentor in the film, the one who played by the actor, I think Philip Essinger, but I think these are all well cast. Robert Lowell was, of course, the important poet who, even in the film, Elizabeth Bishop is mentioning he won a Pulitzer Prize, and he seems to be comprehending Flannery much better than anybody else. I think we can see in the movie that she has presumably some sort of crush on him.
yeah,
He even says to her, "I love you, Flannery," and then immediately follows up with, "That's not a proposal. I have different eggs to scramble," or something like that. So, but it has to be that when she receives the letter eventually, saying he's sorry he can't visit her in Georgia because he's marrying Elizabeth Bishop, that
right.
that losses or deprivations or whatever in her personal life had a huge effect on her personality, and presumably they appear in the stories. There are a bunch of abandoned women in the stories that we see in the movie.
Right. We're getting toward the end of our time here. I have one last question. I hope that you've whet everyone's appetite, and if they haven't seen the film, they'll read her stories. Why peacocks? What
Well,
do you think?
okay, first of all, midway through the film, Flannery, once she knows she's probably doomed to staying home there, says, "If I'm going to be a decoration around here, I need a hobby." And then it's a little while later, we see the crate of peacocks arriving. But I think that it turns out that, and so it's real that she did have peacocks as pets. And at some point, her mother is complaining that the male peacock, the one who opens its
They
fan,
didn't open their, yeah.
didn't open his fan, but and instead was in eating her roses or whatever. But so that I think it's a realistic. First of all, it's a fact of her life. The fact that she could have such a hobby is of interest, and a peacock is such an extraordinary creature anyway.
Did they have peacocks when you saw the house? Are they still on the grounds?
No, not
Who
that
would
I
have been?
remember. And this actually, where I visited was actually Savannah, where she was born,
Oh,
and
I see.
it wasn't even Milledgeville, where there would have been probably more room for peacocks. But the final scene of the film, of course, is Flannery is there writing, and we see Peacock's feathers finally opening up behind her, as if it's if you're patient enough,
You'll see the peacocks.
beautiful things will happen.
We could go on forever. I find it fascinating, and I thank you, Robin, so much for doing this. And I want to thank Wendy DeSanti again of Wildcat Realty for sponsoring it. And I hope everybody's enjoyed the film and will read the stories. Thank you. Bye-bye.